narrative surrounding that war. What really happened? Who really was fighting who? What was the object of the war? What were the real causes of the war? Because there's a lot of simplistic narrative that's been running around. One of the most simplistic that I've heard is that it was a petty battle or squabble for seniority, as between or over seniority, as between Ojukwu and Gowon. That these were typical African pettiness. That one was claiming to be the senior of the other and refused to accept the leadership of the other. It's much deeper than that. Yes, that was an aspect of the narrative, but to suggest that that was the cause of the war is far too simple. And you start asking questions. Once you've read into the story, you start asking questions very early on as to what's the real story. I mean, one of the first things that struck me was that coup, the January the 15th coup, and the emergence of the first military ruler of Nigeria. I found it curious that the parallels between our first military ruler, who we know as Aguiyi Ironsi, Major General Aguiyi Ironsi, and the first military ruler of Great Britain, following a military coup. I found it curious, the coincidence that both of them bore the nickname Ironside. The first military ruler of Britain was Oliver Cromwell. He was the one, if you recall, that executed the King Charles I. If you go to the Houses of Parliament, you see his statue outside the Houses of Parliament, sitting astride a horse, with a Bible in one hand and a sword in the other. That was the foundation of British constitutional democracy, if you like. His nickname was Old Ironside. I had read his biography, and that's how I became familiar with that nickname. So when I was doing the research on Nigeria, I found it curious that the first military ruler of Nigeria also had the name Ironside. His nickname was Johnny Ironside. And I read that he had been given this nickname while this was before he became our first military ruler, while he was serving in the Congo under British officers. And that he was given that name because his conduct reminded them of their former military ruler, Oliver Cromwell. What a coincidence, I thought. Very strange coincidence. That he would then just happen to become the first military ruler of Nigeria. Just like he's, in inverted commas, namesake. I found it curious also, his name. We all know him, and we've come to know him based on the prevailing narrative as Aguiyi Ironsi. My wife is Igbo. So I asked her, what does Aguiyi mean in the Igbo language? Instantly, she said crocodile. I said, what does Ironsi mean in the Igbo language? And she rolled her eyes. She's fluent in the Igbo language, written and spoken. She rolled her eyes and said, it's not really an Igbo word. You can make sense of it if you break it down into two, Iro and then Insi. But it's not a name in common usage. And I also reflected on the fact that double-barrel names were not common in our community, let alone the Igbo community, at that time. And when I stood back and thought about the coincidence, Ironsi, if you write the name Ironside and you take the DE off, you get the name Ironsi. I did some digging, checked on his father's name, and I noticed that it was just Aguirre. These things, these curiosities, stuck with me and made me dig deeper into the Nigeria story. That is a strange thing. That led me to further curiosities. I found it strange that one of the first things that Aguirre Ironsi did when he was installed in power on January the 16th, as early as, I think it was 28th of January, he was already declaring that the regional structure had failed, that Nigerians want nothing more to do with the regions. I found that strange. From what I could read about him, he didn't strike me as one who was a bit of a philosopher, who spent his spare time thinking about governance structures. As I said in the book, and here's the passage, this is in A Fatherless People, under the heading, the 29th of July 1966 counter coup. This is what I wrote. For one into whose lap power had so suddenly dropped, and who had no track record in political science, it is curious that Aguirre Ironsi seemingly had a clear view about the constitutional order that Nigeria needed. Within days, he was declaring that all Nigerians want an end to regionalism. And in February, he had set up his one-man commission of inquiry to report on means by which a united Nigeria could be delivered. On 24th of May 1966, Aguirre Ironsi proclaimed a new decree, number 34, by which he abolished the regions and declared Nigeria ceases to be what has been described as a federation. It now becomes simply the Republic of Nigeria. It was a strange move in the climate of the times. The North's opposition to a unitary Nigeria was common knowledge. They had threatened to pull out of the federation altogether in the wake of the constitutional crisis following the Action Group's 1953 independence motion, and had only been persuaded to remain in the Union by British assurance that the federation with the South would be a loose one. Beyond the curiosity surrounding his name, Ironsi was no stranger to the Colonial Office, having been aide-de-camp to Governor Macpherson. Added to this was the presence of his British predecessor as head of the Nigerian Army, Major General Welby Everard, on a return visit to Nigeria when the coup happened. And then there is the coincidence of the January 1966 coup, with a spate of coups occurring around the same time in various African states that had recently attained independence from European powers. Gabon, February 1964, Algeria, June 1965, Congo Leopoldville, November 1965, Central African Republic, January 1965, and Ghana, February 1966. Right in around the time of the July 1966 counter-coup, in the New Left Review, one Roger Murray made the following observation. During the past 3 years, action initiated or prosecuted by the military has determined the overthrow of no less than 11 African heads of state and has seriously endangered 4 other regimes. 8 of the successor regimes are headed by military men. Over the last 6 months, coups have proceeded at a feverish rhythm. In the aftermath of the January 1966 coup in Nigeria and the unification decree, it was said of the Ironsi administration that, as far as can be discerned, they aim to restore the political institutions of the old colonial era, recreating in a new guise the hierarchy of governor, residents, and district officers, united in a single public service and advised by the subservient natural rulers. Now, as I say, I found this development curious. It raised questions. That's Decree 34, the so-called unification decree. What was it actually doing? Because as was made clear by a book that I read recently, a military government is by its very nature unitary. You can't have a federal government, a federation under military rule. It's a unitary. It's a military ruler. These are not a matter of variations in ideology. It's the military agenda. It's unitary. So it struck me that that's Decree 34 that Ironsi issued on the 24th of May 1966 was a smokescreen. It was an excuse for the slaughter that was to come immediately after. 4 days later, on the 29th of May 1966. That Decree 34 wasn't really doing anything. Nigeria had already become a unitary state. As soon as the military rule ensued back in January 1966. But the decree was needed in order to excuse the slaughter that followed 4 days later. And it was clear to me that the scale of the pogroms wasn't planned over 4 days from the passing of that decree. It had been pre-planned. And what made it clear to me that this was a premeditated program was the 29th of May dates. Now, if those of you who were listening right from the beginning, it took me a while to work out the significance of the 29th, because it struck me that that first coup was 29th of May. Sorry, the first round of pogroms was 29th of May, 1966. The second round, which coincided with a counter coup, was 29th of July, 1966. And the third round of pogroms against the Igbos in the north was 29th of September. 29th of May, 29th of July, 29th of September. When I first came across this or observed these coincidences, I said, what's going on? Why the 29th? The explanation only became clear when I read a very obscure book about the Byzantine Empire. I came across the story of the fall of Constantinople to the force of the Ottomans, the Islamic Ottomans. That was the conquest of Christian Constantinople, which was then the new capital of the Christian Roman Empire, that it fell on the 29th of May. Then the penny dropped about the 29th. 29th of May 1966, 29th of July, 1966, 29th of September 1966. And when you go through the history of Nigeria, or you simply read my book, A Fatherless People, you see a chronology right at the beginning. And you see the number of events, critical events, in terms of the relationship between the North and the South, the power relationship that happened on the 29th of the month. The state of emergency that was declared in the Western region in 1962 that led to Awolowo's jailing was 29th of May, 1962. Even Enugu, when it fell in the war, it was the 29th on which it fell. I think it was 29th of September, but I may be wrong on the month, but not the date. And then you recall how we used to celebrate Democracy Day, 29th of May of every year. So it told me that there was a subscript that was being played out as far as this Nigeria story is concerned. So even when you then come to the Declaration of Biafra, of all the days on which the Biafrans could have declared their independence, it is curious that the declaration was declared at 2 a.m. 2 a.m. on the 30th of May, 1967. That's 29th of May, ends midnight, 2 a.m. Well, you know that most military operations take place at night. So it struck me as a coincidence that even the declaration of Biafra was 29th of May. That is strange, and it set me thinking, because of course, many of the things that, when you look at the surface, you think it's we, the Africans, we, the Nigerians, who are in control. But it's almost, based on my research, it's almost as if it's a Shakespearean play, and you have the actors on the stage who are playing their role. But the play has been written, and people are playing different parts. They believe that they're in control, and like the best scripts, it looks real. You would never believe it's theatre. But in actual fact, when you really understand, it is theatre that's playing out. I will hopefully find a passage that I came across very recently in actually Lugard's biography, which the new generation really need to understand when they're looking at Nigerian history, that how the game is played. As I speak, I'll look for it. Bear with me a second. Just a moment. It's a passage in which they explain how so-called native peoples are to be controlled, and that once you have this quality, that is all you need in order to control us. Bear with me. Well, let me not delay. If I find it later, I'll come back to it. It's a very telling passage. But going back to Biafra, the passage that makes it clear, there's a passage I want to share with you from A Fatherless People, which relates to the end of the war, which shows you or helps you to understand the hidden hands behind the whole operation. The war's end, here we are. The general election, which which were looming in Britain in the summer of 1970 was a significant influence on the war coming to an end in that January. Biafra was Britain's own Vietnam, a war that was competing for the headlines at the same time. The Nigerian army was viewed as conducting a proxy war for Britain's oil interests with just cause. The army had been put together and trained by Britain. General Gowon, the leader of the federal forces, had been trained at Sandhurst. The Biafran forces were led by Colonel Ojukwu, who had been trained at Eton Hall, Chester. It was Britain that was providing the arms and the credits for the prosecution of the war. Harold Wilson had hoped for a short war. As the conflict became drawn out, the moral ground on which he was standing became more difficult. He needed a quick end to the war, but the end had to be on terms of Biafran acceptance of the principle of a united Nigeria, i.e. Biafran surrender. A quick victory meant a resort to more desperate measures, including aerial bombardment of the Biafrans by hired Egyptian pilots. In the words of Ademoyega, now talking about air raids, it is extremely necessary to speak the truth here and now that the federal forces performed horror. These raids, even as perceived from behind bars, were indiscriminate in their choice of victims. Detention camps, refugee camps, prisons, hospitals, markets, schools, private and public homes, churches, and every conceivable target, even trees and grasses. Those raids were of severe intensity and extent and were ceaseless, producing their most horrifying and most disgusting spectacle that could be perpetrated in any community of human beings. The ceasefire sought by the Biafrans could not be granted, as it was seen as a delaying tactic. Only unconditional surrender would be acceptable. The hard line taken by the Wilson government meant more hostile headlines and more desperate efforts for the final victory. Wilson's Labour Party simply could not go to the country to renew its electoral mandate, whilst this war was still filling the front pages of British newspapers and the nightly TV news with images of horrific civilian suffering. Reports of atrocities committed by Nigerian forces against Biafrans had already forced the Wilson government to compel the Nigerian government to recall the offending commanders, Benjamin Adekunle and Murtala Mohammed, from their commands. In March 1969, increasingly concerned about the stalemate that was developing, Wilson decided to fly to Nigeria for a personal assessment of the progress of the war effort. That he had ownership of the conflict was clear in the commitments he wanted from General Gowon. I wanted to be satisfied about the willingness of the federal government to negotiate on anything not involving dismemberment of Nigeria. In the event of a military victory, he should let the colonel slip through his hands to safety abroad. It should come as no surprise that the war ended precisely in accordance with Wilson's script, when at 2 a.m. on the 11th of January 1970, Colonel Ojukwu boarded the last flight from Biafra to safety. Well, that gives you a flavour of the issues in the Biafra War. As I say, this was, as Vietnam was to America, Biafra was to Britain. It was Harold Wilson's war. It ended in accordance with his priorities, the elections that were coming up in Britain in 1970. Right down to the last detail of Ojukwu being allowed to escape. As he said, and this was taken from his own memoirs, I wanted to be satisfied about the willingness of the federal government to negotiate on anything not involving dismemberment of Nigeria. In the event of a military victory, he, i.e. Gowon, should let the colonel slip through his hands to safety abroad. That was necessary because they didn't want Ojukwu to become a martyr for the Igbos. Better to portray him as a coward who ran away at the last. And of course, that's the narrative that took hold. And you read about it a lot, because that helps to demoralize his people. If their leader, who was thumping his chest through the war, at the end slips away. But look at the scripts from his own memoirs. Harold Wilson, let the colonel slip through your fingers to safety abroad. And lo and behold, Ojukwu catches that last flight from Ulu airstrip abroad to safety. But that gives you a flavor of the issues in the Biafra War. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Dele-Oko. That was, very informative. I really thank you so much for taking your time to go through this. I have one question, and then we will take either Tony or anyone from the mods, and then we'll go down again to the audience. But I would like to say, if everybody can keep it to one question each, that will be, easier for us to get through because of the time that we have. So one question for me is, I know you went straight into the Civil War from the last session. I wasn't sure if you had explored the independence, the history around the independence. I'm not sure if you did, but maybe you can touch on it briefly. And then we have some questions from the back channel, which we will take as well. So we'll take people from the audience. So I don't know if you want to answer this question, or I can take we can take Tony or anybody from the mods. Do you want to take this one first?
Let's take the further question. I'll get the passage on the real story behind independence in a second.
Thank you.
Take another question.
All right. Sonia, do you want to go ahead?
Just to be fair, to allow other people to engage the conversation, so I'll just since I have a moderator badge, I'll allow another person to ask a question. That would be nice.
Thank you, Tony. That was very generous. Thank you. Okay, so let's move down. Flash your mic if you want to ask a question. Isoko, so let me take a cue. If you want,
you've had some people who were outstanding.
Oh yes, that's right. Okay, so actually, thank you for reminding me that. So we had Bonka, and then who else was outstanding? Damilola, but he's not on stage anymore. So flash your mic so we can take a cue. Acidics, Isoko Queen. Anyone else? All right, so let's take those two, and then I'll take some back channel questions.
I can see two more people, or one more person flashing. Dr. Cliffhanger.
Okay.
Did you escape me again?
No, we didn't. I just said you go first, and then we'll.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So please keep your question to one question, because we are getting a lot of questions from the channel. If you want to come up stage, you can come up stage, but just bear in mind it's one question each, and let's keep it to 1 minute, if possible. Maximum 2 minutes. We want you to go straight to the question. So this is not like a comment. I mean, you can make a comment, but we have to make sure that it's straight to the question. If you have a question, ask. Because after this session, we can either do it today or tomorrow. We can have a review of the session. So people will have an opportunity to express what they feel about what they've heard today. Bonka, go ahead, please.
Hi, Mr. Dele-Oko. Thank you so much for this session. The question I wanted to ask was on the previous situation. I wanted to know why the British loved the Fulani so much, and why they did everything, because it seemed like they went all out of their way to make sure that the Fulani people inherited Nigeria, with the way they created the northern region, with the way they removed Aminu Kano from the center of focus in the north, and then brought in Ahmadu Bello, with the way they now kind of eventually kind of cajoled Zik to make sure that that power was engineered to the north. I wanted to know what was so special about them that made the British kind of go all out of their way for that situation. That's my question.
Thank you, Bonka. Thank you. So let me take what's the next person? Isoko Queen. Go ahead. Oh, Dele, sorry, Mr. Dele, do you want to take the questions, or do you want to?
Yeah, I'll take the question because I've got to deal with your own requests earlier for some background, the real story of independence.
Sure. Okay.
Let me deal with the real story of independence first.
Sorry, sir. I wanted to know why it actually had to be a direct descendant of Usman Dan Fodio, who was a jihadist, that they saw fit when they brought Christianity as well. So I'm just trying to tie this thing, sir.
Thank you, Bonka. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll deal with that in a moment. Let's deal first with the real story of independence because it ties into Bonka's question as well. How we ended up with effective Fulani rule of so-called independent Nigeria. The real story behind independence. You see, the planning, the decision had been made from the outset in terms of the construct of Nigeria for Fulani rule, that although the British, even in the 1920s, 1900, 1910, 1920, 1930s, or 1930, let me stop there, the idea of an independent Nigeria was far removed from their consciousness. They weren't even thinking about it. They thought that colonial rule was going to run for a very, very long time indeed. There was no concept in their own mind, or no conception of independence. So what gave rise to independence? What was the trigger? As I explained in A Fatherless People, the real story behind independence was President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the US president, in a run-up to the Second World War. You see, what happened was that the real story behind both wars, First World War and Second World War, was a struggle between those who had colonies and vast expanses of imperial land and those who didn't. It was a war, both wars were between the haves and the have-nots. All of them knew that they needed land in order to expand. By virtue of, largely because of the slave trade, in actual fact, the countries like France, Spain, Portugal, Britain, the Netherlands, they had vast expanse of land. You know, islands that we now know as the West Indies, which were actually the land of indigenous peoples, had been taken. The indigents had been wiped out. Those lands became extra land for the settlement of European peoples. If you think of the Americas, Canada, you think of Brazil in relation to Portugal, you think of Latin America in relation to Spain. And then even in Europe, or the European mainland, Russia had vast expanse of land. They weren't involved in the slave trade, but they had vast expanse of land. Germany did not, because it was a relatively new country. It had been under the thumb of France until the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, when the Germans conquered the French. Germany now was a big player on the power stage, but they needed land. And Bismarck was very strategic in his leadership. He knew that having smashed France, the next target was Britain. And he deliberately took, at the Berlin Conference, which he volunteered to chair, to say, we're not going to fight over Africa. As civilized people, let's sit around the table and simply carve it up and agree rules of division. He recognized that the big players were Britain and France by virtue of their, as I said, involvement in the slave trade and predominance in that trade. That Germany had not been involved, so he was content for Germany to take small strategic strips of land next to the main British colonies. So he took Cameroon to be next to Nigeria, took Togo to be next to Ghana, took, I think it's Malawi to be next to Kenya, Namibia to be next to South Africa. But these were strategic positioning. So those are the colonies that Germany had in a run-up to the First World War. The war then happens with a view to conquering the big colonial powers and grabbing more land that Germany needed. It was the Americans who saved the Allies, the European Allies, Britain and France, in that First World War. And as punishment for the Germans, as part of the Versailles peace settlement, the few colonies that they had was confiscated from them and divided up as mandate territories between the winning side, particularly the French and the British. Now, Hitler then comes along and he's determined to take by force the land that Germany needs. And so this is the background to the Second World War. The war starts in 1939. At that point, America is not involved. Come 1941, Britain under Churchill needs America to come into the war. So Churchill makes the appeal to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, US President, for America to come into the war on the side of Britain and France and Russia. Roosevelt makes it clear to Churchill that, look, I'm not sending American troops to go and die in this war, because I know this war is really about the colonies. And I'm not going to send American troops, young Americans, to go and die to save the British Empire. The First World War, we saved you. Now you're back again. The empire has to go. And so in my book, Fatherless, I set out the dialogue between Roosevelt and Churchill over America's entry into the war. And Roosevelt makes it clear that the Americans are not coming in unless the empire goes. So that's a real background to decolonization. The Atlantic Charter was issued August 1941. If you Google it after this discussion, you'll see that in that Atlantic Charter, Roosevelt had obtained a pledge, secured a public pledge from Churchill for the self-determination of all colonial peoples. The reason we didn't, so that was signed in 1941. Pearl Harbor then happens in December 1941, but that's simply the excuse for America to join the war. It's not easy to take your people into a war that's ongoing between the Germans or the Nazis and the British and the French and the Russians. It's got to be sold to the American people, and Pearl Harbor was the excuse that was used. But the commitment to enter the war had already run up to the Atlantic Charter of August 1941. The reason why independence didn't come immediately after the end of the Second World War is simply because Roosevelt died 2 weeks before the end of the war. With Roosevelt out of the way, the Churchill government was able to swing the attention and the focus of the Americans away from decolonization to the Cold War, pointing to the Soviet Union that had now pushed as far as Berlin by virtue of its contribution to the war effort. So that became the priority. Decolonization dropped off the agenda. And with that, the Brits were now able to get into advanced gear in terms of the planning for decolonization. They knew that the issue having been raised now, the commitment having been given in the Atlantic Charter, they needed to think forward. And you credit them for this. This is how the power game is played. You've got to think ahead. What next? We've made a public commitment. They knew it would come back on, even though Roosevelt had died 2 weeks before the end of the war. The thinking had started. Note that the Atlantic Charter was August 1939. The partition of the South by Governor Boudillon, the partition of southern Nigeria, was 1st of April 1939. That shows you how early the thinking was going on in terms of we're going to have to go at some stage. What are we going to leave behind? Who are we going to hand over to? And it's logical. It's not that we Nigerians took up arms and forced the British out of Nigeria. That is real independence. That is independence that you win. But independence is granted to you in which the date of the independence is actually fixed by your colonizer. Rest assured that the terms of that grant of independence have all been thought through in advance by the former colonizer. And so all that was happening from 1939 up until 1960, the actual grant of independence, had all been carefully planned and carefully thought through, and a decision had been made that power was to be given to the North and specifically the Fulani. Now there's a passage from A Fatherless People that I would like to share with you, which illustrates what was going on behind the scenes. The Lancaster House Conference of 1957. So this is 3 years before independence. The venue for the 1957 conference was Lancaster House, a stately building in London's St. James's district. The choice of venue was ironic because the building had been donated to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in 1913 by Viscount William Lever, the founder of Lever Brothers, an imperialist who had made his fortune from the manufacture of soap, whose principal raw material was Nigeria's palm oil. A key objective of the British at the 1957 conference was to secure agreement to the creation of an office of Federal Prime Minister and to an all-Nigerian Federal Council of Ministers, presided over by the Governor General, whose members would be appointed by the Governor General on the Prime Minister's recommendation. The principle was innocent enough to sell, but the devil lay in the choice of Prime Minister. There was no plan for the post to be filled by electoral contest. This was politics by selection. And it was Governor Robertson who would be selecting the person who would be the first Prime Minister. Long before the idea of the new office was presented to the delegates at the conference, he had made his choice in Tafawa Balewa of the NPC, the Northern People's Congress. This is clear from an exchange of correspondence in February 1957 between Tafawa Balewa and Brian Sherwood Smith, the then governor of northern Nigeria. This is a letter, 10th of February 1957, that Balewa wrote to Brian Sherwood Smith. Dear Sir Brian, I am forced to write to you on my personal problems. It is not common with me to worry people with my difficulties, but I trust you as a father, and hence I am writing. I am now thinking very much about my future. The climate of Lagos is not suitable to my health, and I'm never happy here, though I find the work most interesting and the people respect me generally. I've been doing my best to assist in making the federation work, though I myself do not believe that the present type of federation can exist without the British administration. There is much talk now about a Prime Minister for Nigeria after the Constitutional Conference, and my name is being freely suggested as one. Now, I do not like to be a Prime Minister under the present arrangements, and I also do not like to continue with my stay in Lagos. I'm very tired of politics, and I'm seriously thinking of retiring quietly at the end of this year. I cannot see in what other capacity I can serve the northern region, and so I hope to take up my Native Assembly education work again. You will appreciate the delicate situation in which I'm now placed, and so I think of quitting politics without any fuss. I have been discussing this matter with my colleagues for some time, but they do not seem to appreciate my difficulties. Some of them even say to my face that only death can free me from Lagos. If I act, it will be without their knowledge. No British administrator knows more about us in the north than you do, and so I come to you for guidance in helping me to solve my personal difficulties. I appeal to you as a son to a father. Yours, Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. The grooming of Balewa for his role as Prime Minister had in fact begun long before. He had been one of two Nigerian ministers who represented Nigeria at the 1953 West African Forces Conference, which held in Lagos in April 1953. He also attended the meetings of the West African Military Council, which followed. Tragically, Balewa's colleagues' comment that only death would free him from Lagos was to prove a prophecy, as Sherwood Smith's response on 19th of February 1957 made it clear that he had no choice but to fulfill the role for which he had been chosen. His only comfort was to be the assurance that neither he nor the North would be left to walk alone in the cause. Abubakar accepted my advice. In the meantime, preparations were going forward for the 1957 Constitutional Conference, and before leaving Lagos for London, he wrote to me again. He wished me to prepare for him personally 2 papers. In one, he asked me to set out what, in my view, were the essential requirements for a new nation aspiring to independence. In the other paper, he asked me to lay down what I thought should be the minimum safeguards that the North should demand before finally committing itself to independence. The first paper presented no great difficulty, but when it came to the second, I had to stress that constitutional safeguards would not be worth the paper on which they were written once a legislature made up its mind to scrap them. It had also to be remembered that in the ultimate result, it would be the armed forces of the state, the army and the Nigerian police, on whose discipline and loyalty the government of the day might have to depend, maybe for survival. It was therefore of great importance that the composition of both forces, both as regards officers and men, should represent a reasonably balanced cross-section of the major ethnic groups in the Federation. With this vital tip-off on the trump card, which control of the army and police represented within any democratic arrangement, the North was ready to take on the educated natives who had only been schooled in the art of constitutional government. On May 23rd, the delegates assembled in Lancaster House. The Secretary of State, Mr. Lennox Boyd, presided, and this time the regional governors were present, in addition to the Governor General. But our part was largely played in personal discussions in less formal surroundings. In the conference chamber, it was for the politicians to hold the stage. So that gives you the background to the independence charade. It was, Balewa had already been selected. It was prime ministership by selection. He was without consultation. He was given the advantage of incumbency. And the South, having been divided into East and West, two halves, it was easy then for the North to form an alliance with one or the other. And the alliance that was forged, and I use that word deliberately, because it was an unnatural alliance. The alliance that was forged was between the Northern People's Congress and Azikwe's the NCNC. As I explained in the book, it was forged in the sense that it was effectively forced upon Azikwe and the NCNC, because Azikwe was not his own man. He was being blackmailed. He was effectively given an option between accepting the ceremonial position of president or governor general to begin with. That was the title, which is a ceremonial position, or going to prison. They had evidence on him of corrupt practices through his use of the funds of AIB, African International Bank, in the funding of the NCNC's activities. And it was either that he was...
I think that was African Continental Bank.
My apologies. ACB.
No. It's an ACB, yes.
ACB, yes. So he had a choice of going to prison or going to the ceremonial position of presidents and taking his NCNC into that alliance. So that's how the alliance came to be. It was an unnatural alliance. It was not an alliance of values or vision. It was simply a pact that was forced upon him. And so that's the charade of independence. And that takes me to Bonka's question. Why, as he expressed it, why did the British love the Fulani so much? And why, subtext of that is why a direct descendant of Uthman Dan Fodio, which was Ahmadu Bello. That was his prime role, or that was his trump card, as it were, who was made the leader of the North. Now, I touched on the reason for the British pact with the Fulani earlier, but the full background is this: that if you look at the map of West Africa, you will see that the the ceiling, if I could use that expression, the boundary, the interland boundaries of the coastal countries, Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, Togo, Benin, and Cameroon on the other side of Nigeria. You could almost use a ruler and draw a straight line. They're broadly in line, because this was pursuant to the carve-up at Berlin, whereby they were largely operated with straight lines. So it's no accident that the northernmost parts of those coastal countries are broadly in line, because the interland behind those boundaries, those coastal states, was given to France. But if you notice and look at the map of Nigeria, you see it stands taller. The northernmost parts, that's strip, Sokoto, Zamfara, Katsina, Kano, Jigawa, Yobe, and Borno. That top slice ended up as part of Nigeria rather than as part of Niger, French Niger, as a result of a treaty that was kept secret at the time. It was first signed between the British and the French in 1890, because they had come close to a war over that strip of land. Because the British were insistent upon having that strip of land, or that area. The French were insistent upon it because they wanted that. They had calculated that that was part of their space, and they came close to war, the two sides. The Secretary of State, the British Secretary of State at the time, was Joseph Chamberlain. He was a hard-line imperialist. He was determined to hold on to that strip, and if it meant war, he was ready for it. This is how Lugard actually came into the Nigerian space. It was brought in from Uganda. He had been facing the French in the land grab of Uganda, so he had past history, and so he was brought in by Chamberlain to face the French over this space. The compromise that was drawn up was this, that the British also had territorial claims in the island of Madagascar. And they were competing for that island, landing that territory in that island with the French. So the compromise that was struck was that the British would release their territorial claims in Madagascar in return for the French allowing them to have that extra territory, what I call the penthouse or the attic that is Nigeria, that bit that stands above all the others. Now, why were the British insistent on having that space, that Islamic strip, which is now the Sharia states? It was not because there were diamonds or oil or palm oil or any other resource in that territory. It was politically strategic. They knew from experience in India that uniting diverse peoples was a key part of colonial rule as much as divide and rule. So you divide homogeneous peoples, but you combine different peoples in other areas. So in India, they had the experience of the rivalry between the Hindus and the Muslims. even in their own country, they had that experience of the divide between Protestants and Catholics. And even at the time this artificial construct was being created, bringing in almost by force the Islamic strip in what up until that point was looking.
Sorry about that, sir. Please go ahead.
What up to that point was looking like a holy Christian empire or holy Christian colony. They had the experience of the religious differences in Ireland between the Republic and the Catholic Republic of Ireland and Protestant Northern Ireland. Bear in mind, as early as 1911, they were talking about partition of Ireland because of the religious differences. Now, these were Christian constituencies, let alone the combination of Islamic or the fusion of Islamic with Christian territories. So the insistence to the point of being ready to go to war on what we now know as the Sharia states forming part of the British Nigeria, in my view, was driven by long-term thinking about the control of the Nigeria, where the parts of Nigeria where the resources were. It was not a resource-driven calculation. There were no resources in those Sharia states that was driving the insistence upon Britain having what we now know as the Sharia states. It was simply the colonial exercise of fusing or implanting conflict, essentially, which is the legacy we now have. So that was the reason that the British brought them in, and having conquered them, knowing that, in particular, that the Fulani were not indigenous to the space, because bear in mind, those who had been indigenous, there was no real history of them invading each other's space in territorial quests, because, as I said earlier, you don't really do that until you've exhausted your own territorial space. You've run out of land and you run out of resources. Before the colonial intrusion, we were far removed, a long way away from exhausting the abundance of lands that we all had. This is all the ethnic groups who are indigenous to the space, but they knew that the Fulani were not indigenous, and so would look at the area in much the same way as they look at it, which is extractive rather than developmental. So that's the explanation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dologun.
Thank you, sir.
So please, if you do come on stage, just always try to mute your mic so you don't we don't get feedback from that. But anyway, before we go back to the queue, we have two questions from the back end from Mr. Dologun. Queen Sheba, you want to say something?
Yes, so take the last question that I sent in the channel.
All right, okay, no problem.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll just take the last question. It says...
Yep.
Oh, Queen Sheba, you can read it, it's fine. Just go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Tony.
All right. Okay, it says, kindly ask him about how he came about his research for his book, and how hard was it to get first-hand sources? Did he include or consider oral and ethnographic searches? So I'll take it again. It says, kindly ask Mr. Dologun about how he came about his research.
Did we lose Tony? Okay, so I think Mr. Delego, at any point when you feel comfortable taking that question, because I know that we're going on in like a story. So there's a question, and we're just taking some of the questions in the back channel. One is about your story, your research. So Tony, I'm taking it now. So your research. Can kindly ask about how you came about your research for your books, and how hard was it to get first-hand sources? Did you include or consider oral ethnography in your searches? So that's one question. I think we'll take that one. We'll include that one whenever you want to take that, because I know we want to have make sure that the story flows. I can always come back to that again, Mr. Dele, if you want me to read the question again. I just wanted you to know that at the back of your mind that question is from one of the people in the audience. So Tony, do you want to take someone from the stage now?
Yes, sorry about that. I had a call came in. So,
or let's Delay if he wants to answer it now, or
yeah, sure, I can deal with it now.
Yeah, that would be
Okay.
Yeah, I can deal with it. My research technique was unconventional because I'm not your conventional historian. My occupation is as a lawyer, and when I started looking into these issues, I was simply looking to understand the story myself, what was really going on. I was struggling to make sense of a country and their peoples who I knew were largely honest and hardworking people, just like the rest of the world, who were competitive and wanted to win and wanted to be the best they could be. But I saw a country that was portrayed to the world as a basket case, where even though excellent material was available in terms of leadership, the wrong sorts kept on emerging at the top, and they were setting the story. It didn't make sense to me. So my quest started just from self-education. I started reading into the matter, one book at a time. I remember the first book that I really read was the history of the Yoruba, because I wanted to understand my people's, I'm a Yoruba man, wanted to understand the Yoruba story. But in the course of reading that, I started picking up little signs that this story is deeper than what we've been led to believe. So for example, in the Kiriji War, by which what was an empire, the Oyo Empire, or Yoruba Empire, was broken up. When I started seeing evidence in the book by Samuel Johnson, how smallpox, blankets laced with smallpox, was used to kill Bashorun Ogumola. And I knew about the role of smallpox-infested blankets in the wiping out of the native Indians. And I knew about the wars of the native Indians by which those great empires were brought down. I started seeing alien hands or foreign hands in the story. And that book was a great influence. Why? Because Samuel Johnson, who wrote the book, never lived to see it published. It took him years to put the book together. And he sent the manuscript for publication in England. And I told him the manuscript was lost. Now you can imagine this was an age before computers, such that there was no copy of what had been lost. It had taken him years to put that together. And what we ended up with, the history of the Yoruba, was actually what his brother who was a medical doctor, managed to piece together from his late brother's rough scribblings that that's what we now have as the history of the Yoruba. It's not the original text. And that immediately put me on my guard. That, I did not believe that that manuscript was lost. I thought it was buried and covered. People did not want us to know the history. Because when you know your history, it empowers you. Especially if it's written with the intent of empowering you. And so that made me cautious in terms of my approach to the research. I did not go to or advertise the fact that I was researching a history of Nigeria, because I knew that the story was more intricate than what we've led to believe, and that we had to be strategic in putting it together if the story was going to get out. So I was just reading one book at a time. But one of the advantages of having practiced law at the highest levels in the City of London, I was a corporate tax lawyer in one of the huge international city law firms, now called Hogan Lovells. One thing that we were sure of was getting things right in terms of our research. That's what clients paid us heavy money for. So all I was doing was carrying those research skills across to these history books. So I read a total of 80 books. And in the course of reading those books, I'm reading them critically. Just like that city lawyer. Reading them critically, making sure that the story hangs together. And if it doesn't hang together, identifying the weaknesses in the narrative. And so I put the story together based on those 80 books that I read. And so that's why when you read the book, you find that my style is almost like a law report, or should I say a skeleton arguments in court, where the points that you're making are supported with evidence. And the good thing was that the evidence that I'm relying upon is not evidence that can be easily dismissed, because it's not us who wrote it. It is they, the actors, who wrote the books. But at the time they were writing, they weren't really thinking forward to the point that a new generation of Nigerians will come along and read those books. One of the advantages of living in the UK is that you have access to these books. I didn't need to go to the Public Records Office to start asking for documents. I had all that I needed from their books that I could buy. And I bought these books, one by one, read them cover to cover, and the story started coming together. So that was my research approach. And I then put the evidence before the public, put it in the book, and say, well, whoever wants to tell me that it's wrong, let them bring their superior evidence. And so, yeah, that's the answer to the question. My approach was very much undercover, because it needed to be. Samuel Johnson's experience, where he died before his book actually got published. He never saw it published, because that taught me a hard lesson, that powerful histories like this, where you're bringing your story, your people's story out, there will be constituencies who do not want you to get that story out. And so therefore you can't go and advertise the fact that you're writing it. But it's done now, and the book is out there. Our story has been written. The true story of how we got to where we are. That's why it's subtitled, How the Nigerians Missed the Road, the secret story of how the Nigerians missed the road to the promised land, is there for your generation, our generation, and our children's generation. Anybody who wants to challenge the narrative must produce superior evidence, and I'm waiting for that.
Thank you very much, sir. So we'll take one question from the back channel again. So this is let me just read it out for you. Sorry about this. Let me just read it out. Tonya, please, can you read it out? Because I'm just trying to.
All right, sure, I can do that. Just quickly. So we took one question for the back channel, and then we're going to take two persons on stage just to put all of the questions together, so we move a bit faster. So the first question is, please, somebody should ask how the Niger Delta region was roped into the Biafra War, why there was confusion on where the people belong as part of the war, why the Biafra soldiers kill people from that region, what are the lies and the truths. That's the first question that's the only question we're taking for the back channel. I'll take that again so Mr. Dologun, you can get it. So I said, ask Mr. Dologun how the Niger Delta region was roped into the Biafra War, why there was confusion on where the people belong as part of the war, why the Biafra soldiers kill people from that region, what are the lies and truths. That is the first question. I will take two more persons on stage, and then you can just take all of them together. So please, if you want to ask. Yes.
So it's why there were killings from both the Nigerian soldiers and the Biafran soldiers.
Okay. Okay, so it's why there were killings from both the Biafran soldiers and Nigerian soldiers for the people of Niger Delta. Okay, what are the lies and the truths? That's the first question. The next
if he's happy for us to go with the other two questions, or if he wants to take it now.
Let me take it now.
Okay.
Now, in a war situation, as I've explained, this war was really a war over the resources of the Niger Delta, the oil. That was the root of it. And the idea was to keep Nigeria together, to cement the union, which was at risk of drifting apart. Because now that colonial rule, at least direct colonial rule, had ended, they were concerned that the indirect rule would not be effective enough, so it needed to be cemented. And the war was the means by which it was cemented. And that's why I describe it and refer to it as Wilson's War. Harold Wilson orchestrated that war from beginning to end. Now, why were there killings? Why was the Niger Delta roped in? That's why the Niger Delta was roped in. It was the seat of the resources. It was like in a tug of war situation where you do the children's game of tug of war, and you got that rope. The Niger Delta effectively was the rope being pulled by both sides. And it meant that why were Niger Deltans killed by both sides? The explanation is this. In a war situation, there's not a lot of, especially the kind of war that was being conducted. To call it a civil war was wrong. It's not civil war. It was a war between ethnic peoples. And the problem was on the Nigeria side, how do you distinguish between Eastern ethnic groups? If the Northern agenda was to kill Igbos, for example, there's no sort of tribal mark by which they're going to use to identify somebody who's a Ibibio, for example, or Ijo, as distinct from an Igbo person. You're Easterner, you're an Easterner. And so the non-Igbos were going to be caught up in that conflict, whether they liked it or not. This is actually the root of some of the resentments between some of the Eastern ethnic groups and the Igbos. because as far as those Eastern ethnic groups were concerned who were not sympathetic to Biafra or to the declaration of Biafra, they were trying to basically say, we're not amongst. But when the federal forces came down from the north, and when those bombing raids were taking place, nobody was taking care to distinguish one group from the other. As far as they were concerned, East is East. So even, for example, when you look at the Asaba massacre, when the people of Asaba came out and were singing the national anthem, they had been told, come out and declare for the federal side. And they came out obediently, saying, we are Nigerians, and they were singing the national anthem. Just like those young people at Lekki, and the Lekki massacre, who were waving the flags and singing the national anthem. They were massacred and shot down. Equally, on the Biafran side, those who were pro-Biafra. Now, in a war situation, you've got to be, again, there are going to be casualties, because you can't be sure who's for you or who's against you, and it's a matter of life and death. And if the architects of the war have carefully poisoned the minds of your neighbors against you, clearly it's like a Trojan horse situation. There's always the danger of those who are around you being used against you. And as a result, you're going to shoot first and ask questions later. It happens in every war. This is why, for example, in the Second World War, Germans who were living in America, in Britain, were interned. Whether they were pro-Nazi or not, they were regarded as suspects. Because if you didn't do that, you'd be dead before you realize it. So undoubtedly, you have to err on the side of caution. Unless you're sure that they're on your side, you must treat them with suspicion. And you must incarcerate them. And in some cases, with troops on the ground, sometimes they're going to be what the Americans call collateral damage. And this is the explanation for the killings by both sides of people in the Niger Delta. It's difficult to say you're standing apart, that you're not part of it in a war situation. The lines are, the edges are grey. Those coming in, getting troops on the ground, they've been given these weapons. They don't speak your language. East is East as far as they're concerned. And you get caught up in the fire. And as I said, on the Biafran side, there will be, even amongst the Igbos, there were fifth columnists. As I pointed out earlier, it's strange that Biafra was declared at 2 a.m. on the 29th of May. 29th of May closes. The Caliphate's Day, 29th of May, 2 a.m. is when Biafra is declared. How curious is that? That tells you that there were fifth columnists involved in the whole thing. And so everybody's under suspicion in a war situation. And it shouldn't be surprising that there will be abuses on both sides. And it needs to be understood in that context. It's unfortunate, but that's what happens in war.
Thank you very much, sir. Tony?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Deliogu. So we will let one person on stage. Please flash your mic. I'll just pick one person if you have a question. All right, I'll allow Ogbonna to go. Oh no, Ogbonna, apologies. I'll give preference to Adane because she's the only lady on stage. Adane, please go.
Okay. Good evening, Mr. Dino.
Adani, can you? Your audio is not. You're not audible.
Oh,
Are you using headphones or headset?
okay.
Yes, better.
Good evening, Mr. Adelobo. Well, my question will go to the Bori Accord area. I don't know if it's okay for me to ask about that.
Sure.
Okay, so my question is, if Gowan actually implemented the Abori Accord just like agreed, would the war be avoided?
The short answer is yes. The Aburi Accord was an agreement between the Nigerians, none of whom wanted war. None of whom wanted war in reality. They had agreed terms, peace terms. But it was when Gawan returned from the negotiations that he was leaned upon by the British and American high commissions to renege on that deal that would have averted the war. Because, as I said, the war was wanted not by the Nigerians as such. See, I know some uninformed Northerners at present, or of this current generation, go about beating their chests, thinking that they won the war, but of course they didn't. It was won for them. They were just the fronts. Both sides were being used in a wider game, and the wider game was the need for blood sacrifice to cement the union. You heard the passage that I read earlier from Wilson, Harold Wilson, Prime Minister of Great Britain, who went to Nigeria towards the end of the war and said he wanted to have a discussion with Gowon to understand and to make it clear that they could accept any deal provided that it left a united Nigeria. Those are the ones who are after the united Nigeria. To be fair to Sadama, he never wanted a united Nigeria. I want young Nigerians to understand that. It's easy for us now, with Buhari's conduct, etc., to think that that was always the northern agenda. No. Sadama actually didn't want anything to do with the South, let alone a united Nigeria. This is why the North were the ones who were first threatening to leave the Federation as far back as 1954, declaring Araba. Sadama had to die because while he was alive, you could not have one Nigeria. He was concerned and made it clear that we've got nothing in common with these people and I want nothing to do with them. He didn't pull punches in terms of his views. So he was an obstacle to one Nigeria, and that obstacle had to be eliminated and was eliminated. You then begin to understand why Kaduna Zegu was given a full military honours burial. He being the one who actually killed Sadama. Now that is strange, as I said earlier, that of all people to be given military honours burial, the one who killed, massacred Sadama. That is strange. See, Sadama was an obstacle to one Nigeria and had to be eliminated, and was eliminated. So Aburi was the compromise. Indigenes would tend to compromise. There were no real strategic issues at stake. But because the blood sacrifice, as I've said, was needed to cement the Nigeria Union as a deterrent for anybody else to try and leave. Say, remember Biafra. Remember how many who died. So the killings had to be on a grand scale. The suffering had to be enormous. Aburi would not have delivered what the real architects wanted. So the war happened because the Aburi Accord was never allowed to take hold and take effect. And the war was the only way forward.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Delogu. Mr. Delogu. All right. Mr. Delogu, with your permission, can we take two questions, two persons?
Sure. Sure. Because we're going to try and round up by midnight, so let's take it.
Thank you very much. So I'll take two persons. Guys, if I call you to come ask a question, please keep it very brief. 1 minute, max 2 minutes. If you go beyond that time, I'll just mute your mic. Thank you very much. But guys, this is the Niger Delta House. If you're not following the club, please do follow the club, and let's continue to have more conversations like this as much as possible. So I'll take Mr. Acidix. Please keep flashing if you want to speak. And so I'll take Mr. Acidix and Ogbonna. Tonya, I see you flashing. Area, I see you flashing. I'll come to you guys later. Acidix and Ogbonna, please. Acidix, go.
Hi, Mr. Ogun. Thank you for your time. The question I have, I've been listening to you, and you alluded to the fact that the declaration of Biafra, Republic of Biafra, on the 28th of May was part of a grand scheme, or was kind of linked to some grand scheme, which coincided with other things that happened on the 28th of May at different times. I was wondering, wasn't the immediate cause of Ojukwu declaring Biafra on that date because General Gowon had created 12 states on the 27th of May, essentially dismembering Nigeria as we know it, and also splitting the eastern region to separating Igbo majority areas from the other ethnic group majority areas that now constitute part of the Niger Delta. And wasn't that the immediate cause of why Ojukwu had to move quickly to declare Biafra? And secondly, and quite quickly, the minorities of that region had roles to play in the Biafran administration and in the Nigerian administration. I was wondering, in the Biafran administration, were they regarded as equals? Because I also know that in several discussions I have had, there's a quote that there's always a reference that General Philip Effiong was the second in command. Yeah, I'm almost done. Was second in command. But I must also point out that on the federal side, Admiral Joseph Akinwale Way was also an Efik man, half Efik, was also the second in command in the federal structure. So I was wondering what impact these individuals played in the outcome of the war. Thank you.
Can we take the second question?
Sure.
Ogbonna, please keep it very brief.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, and to everybody listening. They've always been this agenda: one Nigeria, one Nigeria. Even whenever we're given the opportunity to speak, they will tell you no-go area. Do you think, in your view, that this strong opposition, this deceit, this determined resistance especially by the Caliphate North, the Northeast and the Northwest, never to agree to a restructured Nigeria, is to continue to keep to this purpose and dream of keeping the component parts of Nigeria weak so that Nigeria will be one. That is what I'm trying to say, is that do you feel that if Nigeria is being restructured, power going back to the regions or the states, that there will be in future an automatic dismemberment of Nigeria? That's my question.
All right, thank you both for your question. Taking Asidis' comments first, he was talking about the immediate cause for the declaration of Biafra on the 2 a.m. on the 29th of May. So 29th of May, not 28th, 29th of May is the key day. 29th of May closes 2 a.m. Biafra is declared. And he was saying, wasn't the immediate cause the reaction to Gowon's creation of the 12 states on the 27th of May, which is effectively the longhand for what Buhari called the ring in the circle, because the effect of the creation of those 12 states was to isolate the core Igbo areas from the surrounding Niger Delta ethnic groups. Now, the way to understand this is this, that there's always, if you look at the narrative only at the surface level, there's always a risk that one misses what is really going on. Let me illustrate that by reminding you of what I said about the American entry into the Second World War. Remember I said that we all, when you look at the conventional history books, they will tell you that America entered the Second World War because of Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attack, unprovoked attack, in December 1941 on Pearl Harbor. That is what led to American entry into the war. But that's because the conventional narratives don't tell you the real story of what's going on. They don't tell you about the Atlantic Charter commitment. They don't tell you, maybe because they don't know, or those who do know do not want you to know about the meetings that had taken place between Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, which I quoted in A Fatherless People. The meeting that had taken place where Churchill is appealing to Roosevelt to come into the war. I became aware of it through the book written by Franklin Delano Roosevelt's son, Elliot Roosevelt. The book is titled As He Saw It. It's largely out of print now, but it was a high-level contact of mine that made me aware of it in order to understand what was really going on. Let me read this section from A Fatherless People that gives you the narrative. It's subtitled A New American Declaration of Independence. To begin with, the United States was once again able to stand back from the conflict, but the cycle of history was completed when the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, traveled to America to make a plea for America to repeat the rescue mission of the First World War by entering the war against Nazi Germany. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had brought America out of the Great Depression with his New Deal economic program, but it was in the field of foreign affairs that his greatness was to become manifest. He was astute in realizing that the First World War had ended without any clear vision of the principles upon which the world was to live in peace after the war. Guided by the shortcomings in President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, he was determined not to repeat the mistake of failing to secure a clear agreement on the shape of the new post-war order before committing American lives to the war. Leaving to one side for the moment the fact that Nazism is hateful and that our natural interests, our hearts, are with the British. But there's another angle. We've got to make it clear to the British from the very outset that we don't intend to be simply a good time Charlie who can be used to help the British Empire out of a tight spot and then be forgotten forever. The discussion between the American president and the British Prime Minister over the future of the British Empire is interesting. Roosevelt. I can't believe that we can fight a war against fascist slavery and at the same time not work to free people all over the world from a backward colonial policy. Churchill. What about the Philippines? Roosevelt. I'm glad you mentioned them. They get their independence, in 1946. And they've gotten modern sanitation, modern education. Their rate of illiteracy has gone steadily down. Churchill. There can be no tampering with the empire's economic agreements. Roosevelt. They are artificial. Churchill. They are the foundations of our greatness. Roosevelt. The peace cannot include any continued despotism. The structure of the peace demands and will get equality of peoples. Equality of peoples involves the utmost freedom of competitive trade. Churchill. Mr. President, I believe you are trying to do away with the British Empire. Every idea you entertain about the structure of the post-war world demonstrates it. But in spite of that, we know that you constitute our only hope, and you know that we know it. You know that we know that without America, the empire won't stand. In the New Deal for the post-war world that was recorded in the terms of the Atlantic Charter, which Roosevelt and Churchill signed on 14th of August 1941, there was to be no place for colonialism. The Charter committed the signatory powers to respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live, and that they wish to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them. Even so, it was simply a declaration of intent. The procedure and timescale by which the colonial states were to be granted independence had still to be worked out. And bear in mind, that was the Atlantic Charter was August 1941. If you check the dates of the attack on Pearl Harbor, you'll see that it was December 1941. So I tell that story as the best explanation for Acidis' comment that when you look at the surface level, that it was the creation of the states on the 27th of May by Gowon that led to the declaration of Biafra on the 29th of May. If you leave it at that level, it makes sense. But when you go back to what I've highlighted as the significance of the 29th of May in the Caliphate calendar, such that, go back to those pogroms. The first one, 29th of May. Second one, 29th of July. Third one, 29th of September. When you go to the declaration of the state of emergency in the Western region, 29th of May, 1962. When you go to, let's give you some other 29th dates, just quickly looking through. There was state of emergency, Western region, 29th of May. Bear with me a second. 29th of July, Gawan overthrown in military coup by Murtala Mohammed. Where we 29th of September 1979, Abandoned Properties Decree. 29th of September 1979 was also the new constitution, dividing Nigeria into 19 states and replacing parliamentary system with presidential system. There are so many dates, and when we return back to so-called democracy with Obasanjo, 29th of May 1999, there are too many coincidences. So for Biafra of all days, that could have been taken. It's just too convenient. So yeah, I don't ignore the excuse. Just as I pointed out earlier in the discussion, when you go back to decree